Hello everyone. In this recording we're going to go through some of the homework exercises for Chapter 17, which is process costing. Now remember, once again, process costing is when we are making items that are very much identical to one another. Tubes of toothpastes, boxes of cereal, things like that, where they're all exactly the same. Therefore, we're going to uniformly allocate all of our costs, materials, labor, and overhead to the items in a very uniform way. Okay, this first homework exercise is actually pretty simple. We are using the weighted average method to try to figure out this company's equivalent units. And so what was given to us? We know beginning work in process, which are 50% complete. We have 4,000 units. We started an additional 16,000 units during the month, and we completed and transferred 14,000 units to the finished goods. And we have 6,000 units that are an ending work in process. They're somewhere on the assembly line at the end of the month. We didn't quite finish them, and there are 6,000 units there. So beginning WIP of 4 plus 16 we started, that's a total of 20,000. Minus 14,000 were transferred. That means 6,000 is the remaining ending WIP. So to calculate the equivalent units using weighted average, and here's the key with weighted average. With weighted average, you are simply going to take the units completed and transferred during the month, 14,000. They are 100% done. With materials, labor, overhead. We added everything to them. That is the reason why we were able to move them along. So we will take the units completed and transferred, the number of units times the percent complete, which is 100%. So 14,000 times 100% equals 14,000, plus the ending WIP, the physical units, times the percent deemed complete, which in this example is 80%. So 6,000 times 80% equals 4,800. So if we take the 4,800 and add it to the 14,000, we get equivalent units of 18,800. So that is the answer there. Very simple warm-up question. Okay, in this next exercise, we actually have a company. They use process costing to manufacture laptop PCs. Their beginning WIP was 50% complete for direct materials. The ending WIP was 75% complete for direct materials. And we need to figure out equivalent units for direct materials. But you see, in this example, we're not going to be using the weighted average method. We are going to use the FIFO method. Remember, FIFO stands for first in, first out. So it's a little bit more complicated than the weighted average. So what was given to us? Well, we have 100 units in the beginning WIP, $60,000 in materials. We started 500 more units during the month. So that means we have 600 units to account for. The beginning WIP of 100 plus 500 we started. So we need to account for 600 units. Out of those 600 units, we know 400 of them were completed during the quarter. That means there's 200 remaining in ending WIP. And we can see the amount of direct materials costs added during the period were $840,000. Well, this question doesn't ask us anything about the dollars. So really that is additional information that we really can zone out at this point. We were asked in this question to figure out the equivalent units for direct materials. And so with the equivalent units, what we need to do is since we're using FIFO, we need to know the amount of items completed during the quarter were 400. Now, out of the 400, how much of them were actually started and completed during the period, and how much of them came from beginning WIP? Well, how many physical units were in beginning WIP? Let's come up here. There were 100. So if there were 400 units, come over here to the left side. If there were 400 units in that were completed during the period, but 100 of them were actually from the beginning WIP, that means 300 100 items were both started and completed in the same period. So out of the 100 that came from beginning WIP that also completed, remember what we said here earlier. We said beginning WIP was 50% complete for direct materials. Well, that means in the current period, that means the other 50% of direct materials were added during the current period. So to convert the 100 physical units to equivalent units, we're going to take the 100 times the 50%, or 50. And we know that 300 units, we calculated earlier, were both started and completed during the period. That means 100% of the direct materials were added during the period. So 300 plus 50. And our ending WIP, 200 units. And the author said ending WIP was 75% complete for direct materials. So from ending WIP, we'll take 200 times 75%. That gives us 150. So if we take 300 plus 50 plus 150, you are going to get 500. So the answer is 500. All right, this next homework problem, we are actually looking at direct labor here, it looks like. Penn Manufacturing Corporation uses process costing to manufacture printers. All right, beginning WIP was 50% complete for direct labor. Ending WIP was 75% complete for direct labor. And we're asking the total dollar value of labor in the ending WIP using weighted average. Weighted average is very, very important to know whether we're using weighted average or FIFO. In this case, we're using weighted average. That is very, very important because the calculations are different. So what was given to us? We know beginning WIP, there were 100 units, and there was $50,000 of direct labor associated with the beginning WIP. During the period, we started an additional 500 units. So that means we have a total of 600 units to account for. I know out of those 600 units, 400 were completed during the quarter. That means that 200 units remain in ending WIP at the end of the period. So to figure out first equivalent units, that's what we need to do first, figure out equivalent units. We know that the ending WIP is 200 physical units, and they are 75% complete for direct labor. So equivalent units for labor is 150, 200 times 75%, or 150. And how many were completed during the quarter? 400. They are 100% complete with labor. So if we take the 400 times plus the 150, our equivalent units are 550. And what are our total costs to account for? Well, $50,000 associated with the beginning WIP, plus $775,000 of costs added during the period. That's a total of $825,000. Those are the total costs to account for. We will then take those total costs to account for. We will divide it by the equivalent units for direct labor, which we calculated at 550. That gives us our cost per equivalent unit of $1,500. We will then, the last step is to take the $1,500 and multiply it by the equivalent units in the ending WIP, which we calculated to be 150. So the ending WIP for direct labor, and we're going to associate $225,000. And that is your answer. All right, number 11. Let's pull up all the information that was given to us to help us. Try to put everything where we can see them. All right, so we have a company, Kimberly Manufacturing. They use process costing to manufacture sensors for the mining industry. The beginning inventory was 60% complete for materials, 20% complete for conversion costs. Those are the beginning inventory. The ending inventory, on the other hand, was 90% complete for materials, 40% complete for conversion costs. We are to use the weighted average method. to compute the equivalent unit conversion cost. Okay, equivalent units for the conversion cost. Okay, so what we're going to do, because we are using weighted average method, basically the first thing we need to do is compute the equivalent units. So what we're going to do is, since we're using weighted average, we're going to take the entire amount completed during May, which was 92,000. All right, 92,000 plus whatever percentage is complete in the ending WIP. So we have physical units 24,000 in the ending WIP, and in the author's explanation it said the ending WIP is 40% complete for conversion costs, and that's what we're doing. Remember, we're trying to figure out the conversion cost equivalent unit. So we'll take the 24,000, multiply it by the percent complete. So the equivalent units in the ending WIP is 9,600, and we will add that to the 92,000 units that were completed during May. That gives us our equivalent units of 101,600 using weighted average. Now what we're going to do is we are going to take 100%, since we're using weighted average, we're going to take 100% of our conversion costs. Beginning inventory, the conversion costs were direct labor 20,320, overhead 15,240. During May, direct labor 182,880, and factory overhead 391,660. You add those four numbers up, and we will divide it by the equivalent units of 101,600. Your answer is 6. $6 is the cost per equivalent unit using weighted average. Okay, we have a situation here where we've got journal entries that we are going to prepare. We have a company. They manufacture digital cameras. They have two departments, assembly and testing. Assembly is first and testing is second. In January, the company incurred $800,000 in direct materials and $805,000 on conversion costs. Remember, conversion is your labor and your overhead, for a total manufacturing cost of $1,605,000. During February, that would be the second month, 5,000 cameras are placed into production. But only 4,000 cameras are fully completed at the end of the month. All direct materials have been added to the remaining 1,000 cameras. However, on average, the remaining 1,000 cameras, basically those are the amounts that are in the WIP stage at the end of the month, they're only 60% complete as to conversion costs. So what we need to do first is we need to compute our cost per equivalent unit. So we were told that we had $800,000 in direct materials, $805,000 in conversion costs, divided by the equivalent units. Okay. Now the equivalent units are 5,000 for direct materials. Remember, the entire 5,000, the direct materials have been added, so the equivalent units is the same as the physical units. But the conversion, it's only 4,600. How did we get only 4,600? Well, remember, we have 4,000 units are fully completed at the end of the month. So for direct materials, it's 4,000 units. Well, 4,000 units are completed, and direct materials, there are 1,000 units in the. 1,000 cameras are in WIP. There are 60% done for conversion costs. Now, what we're going to do is take the 1,000 times 60% equals 600. So for conversion costs, it's 4,000 that are completely done, and 600 is the equivalent units for the 1,000 in the ending WIP. So the cost per equivalent unit, we're going to take the total costs divided by the equivalent units. For direct materials, that's $160. For conversion costs, $805,000 divided by 4,600 is $175. The total is $335. Okay, so this particular homework problem, we need to compute the journal entries. The first journal entry is basically recording to the assembly whip stage, the first whip stage, adding the direct materials to the whip. And we said that was $800,000. So we'll debit whip, and we will credit the accounts payable for purchasing the materials. And the conversion costs, what did we add? $805,000. Debit whip, and we will credit the various accounts. That could be the accrued payroll. That could be all of the other types of overhead items, the FP&L bill, things like that. Now, how much is going to get transferred out to the next whip stage, which is the testing? Well, we concluded that the cost per equivalent unit, we said, was $335 total for both the materials and the conversion. Well, if we take the $335 and we multiply it by the 4,000 units that were totally completed, 335 times the 4,000 units that were totally completed and moved on, you get $1,340,000. So we'll debit the whip for the new whip stage, which is testing, and we will credit the old whip, which is assembly. Okay. And that basically moves it from one whip stage to the next whip stage. Ice cream, ice cream. Yes, we're making ice cream. Dot and Ken Ice Cream uses a mixing department and a freezing department in producing its ice cream. So basically, we are going to have mixing first and then freezing. In the mixing department, there are two direct materials that are being added. We've got the ice cream mix, and we've got the flavorings, and one conversion cost pool. And once again, the conversion costs are all of our labor and all of our overhead combined, and we just add it in one big pool. So let's take a look at what was given to us so we can figure out the answer to this question. Okay. That was given to us. Let's figure out the answer. We'll throw that over here. Okay, so first we are to compute the equivalent units for each cost category. Okay, let me see. So what we have here is, you can see we are starting with 0 beginning whip, but we started a lot during the period, and we have some ending whip. So work in process at April 1st was 0, so we'll bring that over here, 0 physical units. Started in April, 10,000 gallons of ice cream, so we'll added started. So we need to account for 10,000 gallons of ice cream. 0 in the beginning whip and 10,000 started. Out of the 10,000 that we need to account for, it looks like we completed 8,500 gallons. Well, if 8,500 gallons were completed and transferred out, that means the remaining 1,500 gallons are somewhere in the assembly line. They will be in the ending whip. And so we've accounted for our 10,000 gallons. 8,500 of them moved on. 1,500 of them are in the whip. That is your first step, to basically summarize the flow of the physical units. And basically what we're going to do now is figure out the equivalent units. We're going to convert the physical units to the equivalent units. And the information given to us is as follows. And I'm reading over here. It says, the ice cream mix is introduced at the start of the operations in the mixing department, and the flavorings are added when the product is 40% completed in the mixing department. So the mixing department happens first. We're adding all of the materials for the mixing in that process. The flavorings are added along the way. Okay? Conversion costs are added evenly throughout the process. All right, so the ending whip in the mixing department is 30% complete. So let's take a look. Out of the 10,000 units, 8,500 gallons were both completed and transferred out during the period. So in regards to mixing and flavorings and conversion costs, they're all 100% complete. So we take our physical units multiply it by the percent complete of 100%. That gives us our equivalent units for all three: the mixing stage, the flavoring stage, and our conversion costs. However, our ending WIP of 1,500 units, we said that mix is introduced at the beginning, so they're 100% complete for mix. So if we take 1,500 units times 100%, that will give us our equivalent units for the mixing. The flavoring, it hasn't been done yet. Remember, we said earlier, flavorings are added when the product is 40% completed in the mixing department. It's not 40% completed. What does it say? It says at the ending WIP, they're only 30% completed. Therefore, my flavorings haven't started yet. So 1,500 physical units times 0% started gives us 0. And our conversion costs, we said, were added evenly. So if we are 30% done, we will take our 1,500 physical units, multiply it by 30%, and that will give us our conversion cost equivalent unit. So if we add up our equivalent units for ice cream mix, it's the 8,500 plus the 1,500, or 10,000. For flavorings, 8,500 plus 0 gives us 8,500. And for conversion costs, 8,500 plus 450 will give you 8,950. So those are your basically the computation of the equivalent units. That's step 2 in the process. And now what we're going to do is we are going to figure out our cost per equivalent unit. By figuring out the cost per equivalent unit, we need to now introduce the actual costs. And over here on the right-hand side, you can see the author has given us the costs that we've introduced during the period. We've introduced $27,000 of ice cream mix, $4,080 of flavorings, and $53,700 in conversion costs. So those are our 3 types of costs that were added: 2 direct materials and our conversion costs. We will then take our total cost added during the period, and we will divide it by the equivalent units that we just figured out. 10,000 for the ice cream mix, so $27,000 divided by the 10,000 equivalent units. That gives us our cost per equivalent unit of $2.70. The flavorings, $4,080 divided by equivalent units of 8,500. That gives us our cost per equivalent unit of 48 cents. And lastly, conversion costs were 53,700 divided by our equivalent unit of 8,950. That gives us cost per equivalent unit of $6. And then what we are going to do is figure out, using our cost per equivalent unit, to figure out how much of the cost remains in ending inventory and how much moves on to the next step. Well, what we're now going to do is take our cost per equivalent unit, which we said for ice cream mix was $2.70. For flavorings, it was 48 cents. And for conversion cost, it was $6. If we multiply it by the equivalent units that were transferred out, which is 8,500 across the board, times 8,500 times 8,500 times 8,500, we get the cost of goods that are being transferred out. And the cost of goods that remain in ending inventory, we will take the same cost per equivalent units for the mix, the flavorings, and the conversion costs, but we will multiply it by the equivalent units in the ending WIP, which earlier was 1,500 for mix, 0 for flavoring, 450 for conversion costs. That's where you get your 1,500 and 0 and 450 multiplied by the cost per equivalent unit. That tells us the costs that remain in ending WIP at the end of the period. Once again, this works very well and easy because we have 0 beginning WIP. If we had a number of physical units in the beginning WIP, we would have had to make a choice whether we were going to use weighted average or FIFO in order to do this homework problem. Okay, which brings me to the next question. We have beginning WIP And we are deciding to use, as the author says, the weighted average method to assign our costs. So let's take a look at what was given to us. And we can go ahead and get started on this homework problem. So we have an assembly division of quality time pieces. They're using the weighted average method for process costing. And basically, we are to compute equivalent units. That is what we need to do in this homework problem. Equivalent units for both the direct materials as well as the conversion costs. So the first step, once again, in our 5-step process is to summarize the flow of the physical units. The author over here on the right-hand side said, in beginning WIP, there were 100 units, and we started 510 units during the month of May. That means we have 610 units to account for. Out of the 610, we know that 450 were completed. Well, if we have a total of 610 to account for, and we know 450 were completed, that means we know the other 160 is an ending WIP. Now, those are the flow of physical units. The second step is to compute those physical units to equivalent units. Well, because 450 units were completed and transferred out during the period, and if we're using weighted average, that means they're 100% complete with materials and conversion costs. So 450 times 100% will give us 450. So our equivalent units are the same as the physical units. But the 160 units in ending inventory, we need to determine what percent complete are they in regards to materials and conversion costs. The author tells me down here, and I'm highlighting it for you, they're 80% complete for materials and 40% complete for conversion costs. So if I take my physical units of 160, now I'm down here in the work solution in the bottom right. If I have 160 units as physical units times 80% complete, my equivalent units for direct materials is 128, which I'm circling here, and it's 40% complete for conversion times the 160 physical units. That gives me 64 equivalent units. If you add these amounts to what was completed and transferred out, that will give you the sum total equivalent units. For direct materials, it's 578, the 450 plus the 128. For conversion costs, it's 514, the 450 plus the 64. Okay, in this next homework problem, you can see that we are given a lot of information. And basically what we need to do is we need to flow all of our, here we go. We are going to use the weighted average method for process costing, and we basically need to assign all of our costs. All right, so we have a lot of work to do. Let me see, this is a little bit too big, so make it a little smaller. Hopefully you guys can see everything. Okay, so basically what we're going to do is what we were given is as follows. We know that there were 100 units in beginning work in process. We started 510 units during the month. Therefore, we have 610 units to account for. This was basically the ending point of the last homework problem, if you recall. So we had 610 units to account for. And we know out of the 610 to account for, 450 we said were completed and transferred out, 160 was an ending WIP. And the items that were in ending WIP, they were 80% done for materials. That gave us equivalent units of 128, and they were 40% done for conversion costs. That gave us the 64. So here is basically our equivalent units for materials, 578. For conversion cost, it was 514. All right, now what we're going to do is we're going to basically accumulate all of our costs. So we know what costs we need to account for. So our beginning WIP, we can say, was direct materials 459,888. That was given to us. And the conversion cost, 142,570. So in our beginning WIP, 602,458. The author also told us that we added $237,000 in materials for the period and $1,916,000 for our conversion costs that were added during the period. So we know we need to account for $5,755,458 in costs, which is basically the beginning WIP plus what was added during the period. So the next step, after we summarize all of our costs we need to account for, now we're going to calculate our cost per equivalent unit. So for direct materials, we see the total cost to account for, and I have it highlighted here, $3,696,888. We will now divide that by our equivalent units for direct materials, which we calculated over here on the far right of 578. That gives us our cost per equivalent unit of $6,396. For conversion costs, we need to account for $2,058,570. We will divide it by our equivalent units for conversion costs of 514. That gives us our cost per equivalent unit of $4,005. Okay, and so cost per equivalent unit. And after we compute the cost per equivalent unit, the last step is to assign. So we have to assign our total cost of $5,755,458, which is down here. We need to assign it how much of that $5,755,458 moves on to the next step, and how much of that remains in ending inventory, the ending WIP inventory. So what we're going to do is we are going to use our equivalent unit numbers in order to do the assignments. So what was first? Completed and transferred out. Equivalent unit for materials was 450. We will multiply that by the cost per equivalent unit for materials of 6,396. And what do we get? We get 2,878,200. So that goes here. That is the amount of direct materials that was transferred out. Now how about conversion costs? Well, the conversion cost equivalent unit was 450. We will multiply that by the conversion cost per equivalent unit of 4,005. That equals 1,802,250 will be assigned to what was transferred out, completed and transferred out. Now what remains in ending inventory? So for direct materials, those 128 is our ending WIP. We'll take the ending WIP equivalent unit, 128, multiply it by our cost per equivalent unit of 6,396. That equals 818,688. That's what stays in ending WIP. And lastly, conversion costs. The equivalent units for conversion costs for ending WIP was 64. Multiply that by our cost per equivalent unit of $4,005. That gives us 256,320. So if we add down here, we do the math, we've accounted for the full 5,755,458. We know 3,696,888 is associated with the direct materials, 2,058,570 for the conversion costs, and we know how much is being transferred. This is for the journal entry to the next WIP stage or the finished goods stage, whatever comes next. And this is the amount that remains in WIP in the ending inventory, the 1,075,000. Remember, we used weighted average in this example. If we used FIFO, it would have been a little bit different. Okay, this next homework problem, we are a clothing company, clothing manufacturer. They have a knitting department and a finishing department. All right, we are going to focus on the second, or the finishing department. Direct materials are added at the end of the process, so that's interesting. Sometimes direct materials are added in the beginning of the process. In this example, the direct materials are added at the end of the process. Conversion costs are added evenly throughout the process. We're also going to use the weighted average method. So let's take a look at what was given to us. Okay, over here on the far right. All right, so we were told we have some beginning WIP. We had 60 items in the beginning WIP, physical items. That was on the WIP stage somewhere on the assembly line during the month. Now, out of the 60 items, 100 units were also transferred in. All right, so basically they were brought in, they were started. By saying transferred in, we're saying transferred in from the previous WIP stage, which was the knitting department. So we started with 60 somewhere on our assembly line. We added an additional 100 from the previous WIP stage. So we need to account for 160 units. All right, so out of that 160 units that we need to account for, we know that 120 units were completed. So if we have 160 units to account for, and we know 120 units were completed, that means that the rest, or the other 40, were still in the assembly line somewhere at the end of the month. So that would be the ending WIP. So what we're going to do, after we account for the physical units, which we just did, the second step is to basically convert the physical units to equivalent units. So out of the 120 that were done, they are all 100% done. So the physical units and the equivalent units are going to be the exact same thing. For the transferred in costs from the previous WIP stage and the direct materials added in the current WIP stage, and the conversion cost added in the current WIP stage. Now the ending WIP of 40 units, we now need to determine what percent complete are they for transferred in costs, for direct materials, and conversion costs. The author tells us, and I'm over here on the right side, they are 100% complete for transferred in costs. So we'll take our 40 times 100% to give us our equivalent units for transferred in. Our direct materials for ending WIP is 0% complete. Remember what I read in this homework problem. The actual direct materials are added at the end of the process. So that is why they are 0% complete. So if we take the 40 times 0%, that'll give us 0 for equivalent units for direct materials. And last but not least, our conversion costs, we can see are 75% done, complete, with the items on the assembly line at the ending WIP. So we will take our physical units of 40, multiply it by 70% to give us our conversion, our equivalent units, for our conversion costs of 30. So total equivalent units for transferred in is going to be 120 plus 40, or 160. For direct materials, 120 plus 0 is 120. And for conversion costs, 120 plus 30, or 150. So that is the next step, figuring out our equivalent units. 160 for conversion, 120 for direct materials, 150 for conversion costs. Now, the next step is we are going to gather all of our costs we need to account for. So our beginning WIP, 60,000 transferred in costs, that was given to us. 0 for direct materials. 24,000 for our conversion costs. We need to account for 84,000 total. Costs added during the current period, 117,000 transferred in from the prior WIP stage. 27,000 of materials added, and 62,400 in conversion costs, totaling 206,400. We need to account for $290,400 worth of costs. So we are using the weighted average method. So what we are now going to do is compute the equivalent units per unit, the cost per equivalent unit, basically, the cost per equivalent unit. So transferred in costs, what were the total costs to account for? 177,000. we will divide that by the equivalent units of 160 that we calculated earlier. 177,000 divided by 160, that gives us our cost per equivalent unit of 1,106.25. Direct materials total cost to account for, 27,000. We will divide it by our equivalent units for materials of 120. That gives us $225. And lastly, your conversion costs, 86,400 are the cost to account for, divided by 150, which are our equivalent units for conversion costs. That gives us 576. All right, and so basically we figured out our cost per equivalent unit. And the last step in this process costing is to assign our costs. So what we have to do is figure out of this 290,400, how much of it is going to move on to the finished goods and how much of it stays in the ending WIP. And we will do that by basically taking our equivalent units and multiply it by our cost per equivalent unit. So completed and transferred out. Let's take a look at that. For transferred in costs, 120, multiply it by 1106.25. What do you get? 132,750. The ending WIP, what was our equivalent units? 40. 40, multiply it by 1106.25. You get 44,250. Now direct materials. We're going to take our equivalent units for direct materials of 120. Multiply it by our cost per equivalent unit of 225. You get 27,000. And the ending WIP, equivalent units, 0. Multiply that times cost per equivalent unit of 225. You get 0. And last but not least, your conversion costs. Completed and transferred out, 120. Here we go. It's the 120. Multiply it by our cost per equivalent unit of 576. You are given 69,120. And last but not least, our equivalent unit for ending WIP of 30. Multiply it by the cost per equivalent unit of 576. You get your ending WIP, 17,280. Basically, what we've done is we've determined out of the $290,400 in cost to account for, we figured out that $228,870 of it is going to move on to finished goods. So we need to record a journal entry to move that on to finished goods. The remaining amount, $61,530, stays in the ending WIP. So this is a great homework question. It goes through basically everything from top to bottom, soup to nuts, for the weighted average method. And last but not least, we're going to go through a similar example, but we are going to use the FIFO method. Okay, so let's take a look. What are we given? We're a clothing manufacturer, same thing. We have a knitting department and a finishing department. Very similar setup. We're just using the FIFO method. So we have 60 units in beginning WIP, physical units, and we know that 100 units transferred in from the knitting department into the finishing department. So we need to account for 160 units. So out of that 160 units, we know that 120 units have been completed. Now, because we are using FIFO, what we need to do is we need to say out of the 120 units that were transferred out, 60 came from the beginning WIP, and that means the other 60 were started and completed, both started and completed in the current period. And that means if 120 were transferred out and we need to account for 160, the remaining 40 are an ending WIP. So basically, that is just looking at the flow of physical units. And the next step is to convert the physical units to equivalent units. And so what we are going to do is we are going to multiply our physical units times the percentage that was added during the current period. Now, for transferred in costs, 100% of the transferred in costs were completed before it got to this step. So that means which transferred in costs were added during the current period? 0. So we'll take 60 times 0%. That gives me 0. Now how about direct materials? Direct materials, the author is telling me 0% were in the beginning WIP. Conversely, that means 100% of the direct materials were added during the current process. So 60 physical units times 100% will give us 60 as equivalent units. Physical units 60 times 100% added direct materials during the period gives us 60 equivalent units. And lastly, conversion costs, they were 50% complete in the beginning WIP. That means during the current period, the other 50% of conversion costs were added. So if I take physical units of 60, multiply it by 50%, that gives me conversion costs of 30. Started and completed. That means they didn't even exist in the beginning of the month. They were all started and completed during the current period. So the physical units are going to be the same as the equivalent units, 60, 60, 60. And lastly, the ending WIP of 40 physical units. We are told that 100% of the transferred in costs were added during the current period in the ending WIP. So 40 times 100% is 40. 0% of direct materials are completed in the ending WIP. So we'll take 40 times 0% to give us 0. And lastly, 75% conversion costs were done in the ending WIP. So we'll take our physical units of 40 times 75% to give us 30. So we did a lot of math there, but we basically converted our physical units to equivalent units. So our equivalent units is 100 for transferred in costs, 120 for direct materials, and also 120 for conversion costs. So after we compute the equivalent units, the next step is just basically summarize or gather all the costs that we need to account for. From the beginning WIP, the author tells us $45,000 in beginning transferred in costs, 0 in direct materials, $24,000 in conversion costs for a total of $69,000, and cost added during the current period, $114,000 transferred in, plus $27,000 direct materials, and $62,400 conversion costs. You add them up, $203,400. So we need to account for $272,400. Once again, we need to determine out of that $272,400, how much of it moves on to finished goods and how much of that cost remains in the ending WIP inventory. And so because we're using FIFO, what we're going to do is we are going to take not the total costs, but the cost added during the current period. For transferred in, that's $114,000. And we will divide it by our equivalent units. For transferred in cost is 100, so 114,000 divided by 100 gives us our cost per equivalent unit of 1140. Direct materials added during the period, 27,000 divided by your equivalent units of 120. That gives us 225. And lastly, conversion costs added during the period, 62,400 divided by 120, which is your equivalent units. For conversion costs, that gives us your cost per equivalent unit of 520. All right, we're getting closer. So we calculated the cost per equivalent unit, and the last step is to assign our costs. We need to assign the $272,400. How much of it goes on to finished goods and how much stays in ending WIP? So what we're going to do, first, the beginning WIP numbers. This is exactly what was given to us, and that is going to remain in what gets basically transferred out because they were completed during the period. So those numbers move on and they get transferred out. How about the cost added during the period? Transferred in, what did we say? What was the cost per equivalent unit for added? 0. 0 times 1140 equals 0. How about started and completed? Started and completed, what is it? I'm highlighting it. 60 is the equivalent unit. 60 times 1140 will give us 68,400. And last but not least, ending WIP. What is the equivalent units? 40. 40 times 1140, that gives you 45,600. Now let's move on to direct materials. The beginning WIP we said was 0. Now how about from the beginning WIP, completed and transferred? What was the equivalent units for direct materials? 60. 60 times 225, that will give us 13,500. And how about in the that was started and added to beginning WIP and started and completed? How much is it? Also 60 multiplied by 225. That'll also give you 13,500. And an ending WIP. What is the equivalent units in ending WIP? 0 times 225 will give you 0. And last but not least, the conversion costs. From the beginning WIP, it was $24,000. That moves on. Now, how about costs added to the beginning WIP during the period? What is the equivalent units from that? 30 times 520, which is the cost per equivalent unit. That'll give you 15,600. How about started and completed equivalent units for conversion cost? 60 times 520, the cost per equivalent unit. That'll give us 31,200. And last but not least, in ending WIP for conversion costs, the equivalent units is 30 times 520, the cost per equivalent unit. That also gives us 15,600. Well, we filled in the schedule. So now you just basically do the math. And we have a total column here. So beginning WIP, 69,000 plus cost added to beginning WIP for the period, 29,100. That'll give us a subtotal, 98,100. Plus what was started and completed during the period, 113,100. That means $211,200 is going to move on. It's going to move from the WIP account, the WIP finishing department, to the finished goods. And the remaining 61,200 is going to remain here in ending WIP. If you add these two numbers up, the 211,200 plus the 61,200, you have accounted for the full $272,400 worth of costs that we need to account for. Long process. Hopefully you understand the difference between weighted average and FIFO. That comes into play when we have beginning WIP and we have ending WIP, and we need to make sure that our costs flow through the process, through the assembly line in the proper way.